I had lost everything, betrayed and beaten down to rock bottom. But just when I was about to give up, he appeared, Norman, a powerful alpha who gave me not only hope but also a home. Yet as our love began to blossom, my past threat and to destroy everything we had built, I had to fight, not just for myself but for my daughter Abigail, for our future. This is a battle of love, sacrifice, and courage, and the outcome of this fight will determine our destiny. Chapter 13. It's been a week since Norman kissed me like he had on the beach when we should have been training. It's been a week with no signs of Blake or his pack trying to attack us. The warriors are starting to wonder if he ever will, but I'm scared they'll let down their guard and that's when Blake will attack. I've learned not to underestimate him. He'll get you when you least expect it, and with the reputation this pack, as being the largest, he'll want to attack when we least expect it. With him, it could be years from now when he attacks, when we've all but forgotten about the possible threat he causes. But I haven't forgotten I spent too long with him to ever doubt what he's capable of. And for now, I'm trying to keep the pack on their toes so that he doesn't strike when we least expect it. Abigail's been in my care for a week now. Norman came through with his promise, making me her legal guardian. The look on her face when I told her I was now basically her new mom was priceless. I already knew she was attached to me, but seeing how happy she was going to be mine, so to speak, was just an amazing thing. Abigail moved rooms earlier this week, after telling her that she was now basically mine, so now she has a room up on the top floor right next to mine. We spent the week, Norman included too, painting the walls and decorating it however she wanted it. And Abigail wanted princesses everywhere. Poor Norman came out of her room nearly every day with pink and purple paint all over him. But he'd leave with a smile every time because he honestly never got to do this with a child of his own. We finished Abigail's room late last night, her sound asleep in her old room until the new paint smell wasn't as strong and the paint was dried. I woke up early this morning, unsure why really as I sat there on my bed in nothing more than a simple nightshirt with the sheets pulled around my hips just as there was a knock at my door. Riley, Norman's voice called out through the closed door. "Come on in, Norman." I called out just as he slowly pushed the door open and peered into my room. "You want to get away for a while?" he asked, looking at me from my doorway. "Just you and me, away from the prying eyes and ears of the pack. You've been stressed more than me since we've gotten back. But won't the pack need its alpha?" I asked, arching an eyebrow at him as I waited for his answer. "They'll be all right for a day," he said, smiling. "But I can't have my Luna on the verge of a mental breakdown because of too much stress. Now get your butt out of bed and let's go do something. Just us." "Did you just call me your Luna?" I said as I lifted my eyebrow while a smirk appeared on my face, his own going a light shade of pink after realizing what he just said. "Just get dressed," he said quickly as he backed out of my room. "I'll meet you out front in a few minutes." I started laughing as he shut the door, leaving me to get dressed in private, sobering up, and wondering just what this strange man could have planned for just the two of us away from the rest of his pack. I climbed out of bed and pulled on some clean clothes. Once dressed, I walked out of my room, then down the stairs, of course not missing out on the familiar voices of the two girls from the other day gossiping once again about Norman and myself like they had nothing better to do with their time. Continuing on like I hadn't heard them and refusing to let them ruin my day with Norman. I pushed their voices out of my head as I opened the front door to the pack house to spy Norman standing out front with none other than a motorcycle beside him. "Is this yours?" I asked, smiling as my eyes took in the beauty beside this man. "Why, yes it is," he said, smirking before straddling the seat. "Would you like a ride?" "Oh hell yeah," I said, causing him to laugh as I ran down the front steps before climbing onto the bike behind him, wrapping my arms around his midsection to hold on as he started the bike. "Hang on," he said, peering back at me over his shoulder as I gave him a wide smile while tightening my grip around him. I didn't ask Norman where it was we were going as he pulled off from in front of the house. I figured I'd let him surprise me, but I never expected him to take me back to that same small clearing we had visited back on my first day as his pack loon, just after my shoulder had healed up from the bite. Confused when he pulled to the edge of the clearing and stopped, turning the bike off in the process. I climbed off the bike and waited to see what he was doing. "What?" he asked, smiling as he declined off when he saw the confused look on my face. "Why do you bring me here?" I asked, and even though I was confused as hell, I still couldn't stop the smile that was on my face. "Because from your reaction that day we first came here," he said, smiling at me, "I knew you liked this place. And what better way to let go of stress than here? So this is why you brought me back here?" I asked, smiling at him as I looked around the clearing before looking back to him. "It's one reason," he said before holding his hand out to me. Slightly confused, I grabbed his hand as I allowed him to lead me towards the center of the small field before he sat down on the grass, pulling me down with him, landing with a plop right beside him. I started laughing as I leaned my head against his shoulder slightly. "Norman," I whispered as I tried gaining my breathing back to normal. "Why are you acting like a teenager all of a sudden who's with his girlfriend?" When I didn't get an answer, I peered up at him as I still leaned slightly into his shoulder, my eyes looking back and forth between his as I waited to see what he'd say. "Norman," I asked with my smile faltering as I continued to wait for his response, but my heart was telling me to be prepared for him to shove me away. "Riley," he said as I watched him break eye contact with me and look down to his lap. "I don't really know what's going on right now." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused as he continued to stare at his lap. "Ever since that first kiss on the beach. And then that last one when we were training. My wolf has been going crazy when I don't at least see you for hours on end. I haven't felt this way, not for a while since she died, and I'm just so confused." I felt my heart rate pick up as what he said sunk in. I wasn't the only one feeling this, but it was confusing him to no end, it seemed. Lifting my right hand, I gently placed it on his cheek, causing him to finally look back up and see me. "My wolf wants to fight for control every day," he said as he leaned his cheek against my hand, "wanting nothing more than to be around you. And then when I am, I have to fight to keep from losing the control I have over him, like right now." "What does your wolf want?" I asked as I felt him turn his head slightly and placed a small kiss on the inside of my palm. "He's grown protective over you, especially after what your ex-mate said about you. He's seen the way the younger unmated wolves look at you when you're not paying attention. He wants me to mark you, claim you as ours so no one else will look at you like that again." My heart was hammering against my ribcage by now as I tried to keep my face cool. "And you? What do you want?" I watched as he peered at me, his blue eyes seeming to pierce right through to my soul as he slowly leaned towards me. My eyes fluttered shut, just as his lips gently pressed against my own. I felt my breath leave out through my nose at the same time I felt him pry my lips open gently with his own just before his tongue snuck its way in. The kiss didn't last long before Norman pulled away, leaving his forehead against my own as his blue eyes opened to reveal them to be darker than moments ago. "I want the same thing," he whispered out, his breath fanning against my face as his blue eyes peered down into my brown ones. "Are you sure?" Wanting him to be absolutely sure about this. "You're right," he said with his forehead still resting against mine. "It's time I move on. Think about what would be best for the pack and not wallow in myself, busy over losing my mate. I've been given a second chance at happiness. So have you. So why should I make us both suffer any longer than we need to?" My hand, still resting on his cheek, even after the kiss slowly slid up to his hair before gripping onto it tightly and pulling him slightly closer. "Then what are you waiting for?" I asked as my eyes looked back and forth between his again before he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to mine in a harder kiss. I felt him push me until my back was lying flat on the ground, and he was hovering over me, not even breaking the kiss in the process. My breathing picked up as he moved from my mouth, placing kisses that started there at the corner of my lips and moved down along my jaw and then my neck until he reached the junction where my neck connected with my shoulder. I felt his lips open as he began adding a little suction as he continued to search for the place he liked best. But when his lips found what he was looking for, all it took was a slight moan from me when he found my sweet spot before he added a bit more suction to the spot he had chosen. And then, just like that, I felt a sharp sting in my neck where he had his mouth as he bit down onto where he wanted his mark in my soft flesh. The pain lasted barely a second before the most intense form of pleasure I'd ever felt took over my body, causing my back to arch up off the ground and into his chest, still hovering over me. With my eyes closed as I enjoyed the feeling, I could see stars dancing around behind my eyelids before his mouth released its hold over my neck. I felt myself release as my body slowly began to relax and my breathing attempted to return to normal. Both of Norman's hands were on either side of my head as he held himself up over me as my own had moved from his hair to bunch up his shirt on both sides, just under the arms. Before I could open my eyes to try and focus on him, I felt his tongue gently swipe across my still tender neck, cleaning off any blood that may have come with him marking me. Just the feeling alone of him doing that sent a jolt of pleasure through me. Slowly, I opened my eyes and peered up at Norman as he peered down at me, his blue eyes back to their normal shade of baby blue. I looked up at him, still trying to slow my breathing as I waited for him to speak first. "Now," he said finally after a few minutes while looking at the new mark he'd left on my neck, "you belong to me. I don't think I'd want it any other way." I whispered out weakly as I smiled up at him before he lowered his lips to mine, giving me another gentle kiss that I was growing to love more and more every time. Chapter 14. Everything seemed so different between Norman and me after he marked me. It was like my attraction to him increased significantly afterwards. We spent the entire day away from the pack, just him and I, enjoying each other's company while he took my mind off of the possible threat of attack from my former pack. When we finally got back to the pack house, it was late and most everyone else was already in bed. "I think I really needed that today," I said to him as I looked down to my feet while we walked up the stairs to our floor. "I just needed to take my mind off of everything going on." "We'll have to do it again," he said, smiling at me as we reached my room door. I bit my lower lip as we stood in front of my door and looked up to him. "Good night, Ray," he whispered after a few minutes before he lowered his head and placed a gentle kiss on my lips. My eyes fluttered close for the few seconds the kiss lasted before I felt him slowly pull away. "Good night, Norman," I whispered back as I slowly opened my eyes to look at him. I smiled up at him as he lightly placed his hand on my cheek before he turned and walked down the hallway to where his room was. Closing my eyes and taking a deep breath, I turned and walked into my room. I shut my door and changed into what I planned on sleeping in that night before I started making my bed up. As I was working on straightening my bed, there was a knock at my door. "Yes," I called out, looking over my shoulder as my back was to the door. "It's Jenna." Jenna's voice came from the other side of the door. "Oh, come on in," I said before quickly moving my hair over my neck to hide Norman's mark from view for now. "You two were gone all day today," Jenna said as she walked into my room and walked around to the other side of my bed so that she was facing me. "Abigail, missed you. She kept asking where you went all day." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, looking up at Jenna. "Norman decided to take me away to get some fresh air and to get away from all the stress I was dealing with. And that took the whole day?" Jenna asked, quirking an eyebrow at me. "We lost track of time, I guess," I said, shrugging. I guess shrugging was the wrong thing to do because in that next second, Jenna's eyes were glued to my neck and shoulder. "Jenna," I asked, watching her as she just continued to stare. "Riley," she whispered. "Is that what I think it is?" I said, feeling my cheeks heating up. "Oh my God, really?" she squealed out. "Today," I said, making it sound more like a question than an answer. "I'm so happy for you," she said, running around my bed and instantly wrapping me in her arms. "For both of you. Now I see why you both were gone all day today. Why did he mark you? It's kind of tricky to explain," I said as I sat on my bed. "I just know it was because of that first time he kissed me, before we went to my old pack without realizing that's who it was we were going to see. After that he said his wolf had been going crazy. So are you two like together now?" she asked, smiling as I shrugged. "I guess," I said, and sure, we didn't really discuss that. After he marked me, we just spent the day together. Although even now, after being marked, my wolf is going crazy because I'm not near him." Jenna went to open her mouth, but was halted by the sound of knocking at my door. That next second it opened to reveal Norman standing there peering in. The look on his face when he spotted Jenna beside me, and my hair moved over my shoulder revealing the mark he left, was priceless. "So Norman, Jenna said, smirking as he walked into the room. When were you going to tell me that you marked Miss Riley over here? When we finally announced it to the pack, he said, quirking up an eyebrow with a playful smirk. How'd you find out anyway? She was trying to hide it, Jenna said, pointing to me, but when she shrugged hers the hair moved and the mark revealed itself to me. Norman, I'm so very happy for you both. Glad to know we've got your approval, he said with a smirk still on his face as he looked at me then back to her. But don't you need to be getting back home to Matt and your baby? Yeah, I see I'm not wanted here, she said, rolling her eyes and laughing before hugging me. I'll see you tomorrow, Ree. I watched with a smile as she stood up and walked to Norman, giving him a hug as well before walking out of the room and leaving it just the two of us. It was quiet for a moment between us, as Norman shifted his weight from one foot to the other as he glanced down at the floor. Was there something you needed, Norman? I asked, smiling, when you came and knocked on my door. I watched as his cheeks instantly heated up, causing me to have to cover my mouth to keep from laughing. I yawned. He started as he looked to his feet. I couldn't sleep, and my wolf wanted to see you again. Just your wolf? I asked, raising one eyebrow to look at him. Well, I mean I did too, he said quickly, which actually did cause me to laugh. Norman, I am teasing, calm down, I said, standing up and walking to stand in front of him. I smiled up at him, my eyes going back and forth between his as I waited to see what he'd do. He peered down at me before slowly lowered his lips to mine as his arms moved out to circle around my waist and pull me closer to him. It didn't last long before he pulled away, his forehead resting against mine. I don't think my wolf will allow me to sleep at night now, without you in bed next to me. Your wolf? Well, you won't be able to sleep without me right next to you. I watched as his cheeks began to turn pink once more before I lifted my hand up to rest on his cheek as I smiled. Would you believe me if I said both? He asked, causing me to laugh. I might, I said, smiling. But before I go anywhere with you, I need to stop by Abigail's room. Jenna said she missed me today. We could do that, he said, smiling before grabbing my hand that was resting on his cheek and holding it in his own as he led the way out of my room. And I don't think I was ever truly going to get used to Norman holding my hand like this, no matter how many times he did after he marked me. When we got to Abigail's door, he let go of my hand as I pushed the door open as quietly as I could. When I peered in, the room was dark save for her little pink night light that lit up the room in a soft pink glow. I looked back to Norman for a second before I pushed the door open a little wider and quietly made my way into her room. I smiled down at her as she slept so soundly in her bed. I sat down on the edge of the bed before gently brushing the hair out of her face that had fallen there in her sleep. My simple touch caused her to stir, her little eyes opening sleepily as she peered up at me before a sleepy smile made its presence known on her face. Mommy, she smiled up at me, causing me to smile back down at her. That's right. She's been calling me Mommy these past few days since I basically adopted her, and I didn't mind her calling me that. Hey, sweetie, I said as I gently stroked her head in the same place I had moved the hair. I heard you kept asking about me today. I'm sorry I wasn't there. It's okay, Mommy, she said, smiling up at me still. I'll make it up to you, I said, smiling. Tomorrow we'll do something together. Just me and you and nobody else. How does that sound? Okay, she said, smiling widely. Well then, go back to sleep, I said, leaning forwards and placing a small kiss on the top of her head. And I'll see you first thing in the morning. Good night, Mommy, she said as she yawned before rolling onto her side. Good night, Abigail, I said before standing to my feet and walking back over to where Norman still stood by the door with a smile on his face. What? I asked as I walked out and he closed the bedroom door behind us. You're very good with her, he said as he wrapped his arm around my waist before leading the way towards his room. I love kids, I said, shrugging with a smile. And it broke my heart that Abigail had been asking about me all day when I was with you in that meadow. So I want to make it up to her by spending the day with her tomorrow. Well then, he said, smiling as he opened the door to his room. I guess we better get to sleep then. If I remember correctly for Jenna, Abigail wakes up early. I guess we better then, I said, smiling as I stood on my toes and gave him a light peck before moving around and going to the other side of his bed that was in the center of the room. Chapter 15. I woke the next morning, feeling like I was lying on a cloud instead of a bed. Last night was the best sleep I've ever had in years, since I was little before my parents were killed. I shifted slightly on the bed, feeling something resting on my waist. When I look down, it's an arm and I can't but smile as the memories of yesterday rush forward to remind me of why I'm in bed with someone. I turned slightly to look behind me to see Norman's face nuzzled into my hair behind me as his grip on my waist tightens just a bit. I smiled at the man behind me before trying to roll over onto my back without disturbing him as I do. When I get settled again, his arm still wrapped securely around me, I reach my left hand up and gently brush away some of the hair out of his eyes. His grip tightens on my shirt by my side before it releases, and I hear him groan as he starts to wake up. I watched as he slowly opens his blue eyes to look at me, a smile on his face when the sleep clears and he fully sees me. "Good morning," I whisper to him as I repeat the action of brushing the hair from in front of his eyes. In that next second, he rolls over me, hovering above my body as he has my hands by my head while he smiles down at me. "Good morning," he whispers back, his voice full of sleep still as he lowers his head and places a light kiss on my lips that leaves me wanting more. He pulls back to look at me before dipping his head back down and giving me another, longer. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "Okay, Norman," I say, smiling as I pull back from his kiss where he goes straight for my neck. "We need to get up. I promised Abigail I'd spend the day with her after not getting to see her yesterday." It seemed like he ignored me as he continued kissing down my neck, growing ever closer to the mark he'd given me. "Okay, I'll rein it in," I said, pulling my hands from his and pushing him back slightly by his shoulders to where he was able to look at me in the eyes instead of me peering at the top of his head, his hair creating a curtain around his face. I bit back a laugh at the sad look on his face. "No," I said, smiling as he poked out his bottom lip into a pout to try and get me to fold. "Not happening. I have a little girl that I promised would get to spend time with me. I'll see you tonight after I put her to bed." With a final shift from me, he rolled over back to his side of the bed so I could get up. I watched as he sat himself up slightly on his elbows as he decided to watch me get up from the bed and make my way towards the door. I turned back once I reached the door, smiled and waved at him, before walking out the door and closing it behind me. I was just reaching my bedroom door when I heard a little voice behind me. "There your mommy," the little voice said, causing me to turn around and smile when I spot Abigail at the top of the stairs. "Where were you?" "I was around," I said, smiling at her. "But let me get dressed and get something to eat, then we can go and do something. Just the two of us like I promised you last night, okay?" "Okay," she said, smiling as she ran back down the stairs, causing me to laugh and shake my head. Abigail rushed me all through my breakfast after I got dressed and met her downstairs in the kitchen. All I could do was laugh as I finished my meal and put away the dirty dishes before taking her hand and following her out of the pack house. I held her hand tightly as we walked around, trying to figure out what the two of us could do for the day. We finally decided on a walk around the perimeter, but far enough away so that we weren't too close to the territory's edge. I made sure to let Norman know where we were and that we should be back by a certain time before we headed out in the direction of the woods. I wasn't sure if Abigail had been out this far, as she looked around at everything with wide eyes and curiosity. "Can we play hide and seek, Mommy?" she asked, tugging on my hand, and looked up at me with big eyes as I looked down at her. "It's not that fun when it's just people, Abigail," I said, looking down at her as she started to pout. "Please, Mommy," she said as she peered up at me. "One?" I said, smiling as she grinned before letting go of my hand and running off in one direction while I covered my eyes and continued to count. I peeked through my fingers as I got closer to the final number before shouting it out and lowering my hands, looking around for the small child I brought out here with me. "Ready or not, here I come," I shouted out as I looked around with a smile on my face for the little girl. I looked around and behind trees, rocks, and bushes. I knew she wouldn't run off far, or I would at least hope she knew better than to run too far after the rogue attack we had back after I joined this pack. My smile began to falter when I still hadn't found her. "To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I called out as I picked up my pace, looking for the child that I had been playing with out in the middle of the woods. My search became frantic when there was still no sign of her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I yelled, Abigail, where are you? Mommy. I heard a faint scream come from the direction of the border. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I yelled as I ran off in that direction. The child wasn't mine by birth, but it was almost like my motherly instincts kicked in, knowing she was in some sort of trouble. I crossed over the border to our Paxland without a second thought as I ran again. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I yelled again, stopping for a second and looking around as I breathed heavily from the run. Mommy. I heard her cry come from my left. Closer than before, but not close enough for me to know that I'd see her in a couple seconds without running to her. And running I did, in the direction her voice came from. I knew it was dangerous to be outside the pack territory, but my motherly instincts were pushing me towards finding her, and I wasn't stopping until she was found. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I cried in relief when I finally found her, but that relief was short-lived when I saw she had her hands tied behind her back, going on the defense. I looked around for any signs of a threat before making my way over towards her. Putting my attention back on her, I moved in closer and going for what was binding her hands behind her back. Look out! Abigail shrieked, staring off behind me. I quickly turned around to see a man, familiar looking but at the same time not. I was on the defensive once again as I moved away from Abigail in case this should turn into a fight. The last thing I wanted was for her to get hurt. I went to make a move towards him, this evil smirk on his face, before I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head and the world went black. When I finally came to, my head hurt something awful and my wrists felt like they were on fire. Groaning, I opened my eyes slowly as I looked around at my surroundings. Mommy. A small voice came from in front of me, my eyes shooting wide open. I looked ahead to see Abigail looking at me with scared eyes as she stood behind a set of bars. Mommy, she asked, looking at me with tear stains on her cheeks like she'd been crying. Are you okay? Before answering her, I looked up to see where my wrists were hurting. I was shackled to the ceiling, and if I had to guess, there was silver mixed in with the iron of the cuffs. I looked back down to Abigail, and went to speak when I was cut off by an all-too-familiar voice. Are you finally awake? The voice said that belonged to none other than Blake. Good, now the fun can re-begin. Chapter 16. You can keep me, but let Abigail go, I said through gritted teeth as Blake threw another punch into my stomach, and the chains holding my wrists being the only thing keeping me from hitting the ground in pain. She's just a child, Blake, I growled when he started laughing, like what I said was the funniest joke in the world or something. I wasn't sure how long I'd been there before I woke up to see her in that cage. What's worse, she has to sit there and watch as I get the shit beat out of me. I could take it. I have before, but I didn't want her to have to see that. I looked at Abigail, tears in her eyes as she watched what this man she'd never seen before was doing. Before I could turn my attention back to Blake, I felt a hard punch to the side of my jaw, causing my head to in the opposite direction the blow had come from. I'm not letting the kid go just so she can run back to your alpha and get help. He sneered down at me as I let my head dangle after the punch. You're mine now, really. I closed my eyes for a second, just wanting the pain to go away as my wrist burned more. Every blow he gave me as my weight pulled down on the restraints that held me up. Mommy, Abigail's voice shouted out and causing me to open my eyes slowly. I felt my hair on my shoulder being moved by a hand before the sound of cursing came from close by. Lifting my head, I looked down to my shoulder and realized that he'd seen the mark left there by Norman. A mate's mark. Why didn't you tell me she'd been marked? I heard Blake's urgent and harsh whisper as I looked over to Abigail. I didn't know. One of the other guys in the room said as they both looked back to me as I turned my attention to them. What are we going to do, Alpha? Get rid of the kid, Blake said, with a flick of his wrist like she meant nothing at all. I'll deal with her. At that point, knowing that now Abigail's life was in danger, my wolf was up to the surface and I wasn't about to hold her back. No, I shouted out and catching the two off guard as the guy went to go towards Abigail. Blake glared at me before moving towards me, but he wasn't prepared with the knowledge of the fact I'd been training. Grabbing a hold of the chain above me, I lifted myself up with my arms and kicked both feet out towards him, hitting him in the stomach. When Blake hit the floor, I looked over to the other guy to see he was stalking his way towards me. I could hear Abigail crying out in the background as I turned my attention to the chains above my head and was working on trying to get out of them. When you have nothing to lose really, or in my case mother instincts were kicking in, you don't care how you get out of a situation as you can. Looking back down to the guy, he was getting too close and I was still chained. Growling in frustration, when he was within range, I kicked him in his family jewels and smirked with satisfaction as he fell to the floor holding his crotch and groaning. I looked back up at the cuffs, trying to at least slip them so I could get my hands free before glancing back to check on the two men in the room and make sure they weren't coming at me yet, satisfied that Blake at least was down for now. I turned my attention back to my hands as they slowly began to slip out of the cuff. But of course that hurt like a real bitch. With a final jerk of my hands, they were free, rubbing my wrists which were bloody and raw and sore as hell. I looked around for the key to the cell that Abigail was standing in. "Mommy, look out." I heard her voice call out as I had my back to her and the rest of the room. Turning around quickly, I only had enough time to dodge out of the way of the guy making a lunge for me. But just barely. I moved back away from watched as he turned around and glared at me. Hatred in his eyes. "Stupid bitch." He snarled before lunging at me again, but this time I didn't back out of his way. I sidestepped slightly before lifting my knee and catching him in his gut. Grabbing to fist's foot of hair, I brought his face down hard on my knee, knowing him out cold instantly. Looking back to Blake, he was still down on the floor. Glancing at Abigail as she watched me, I quickly turned and went back to the table I had previously been looking at and looked for the keys to get her out. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I whispered as I tossed everything to the side looking. Where are the damn keys? Ah, here we go. I quickly turned back around and ran for the cell door, jamming the key inside after finding the right one and unlocking it. "Mommy," she cried out as she ran into my arms once the door was opened. I hugged her tightly, my wolf already starting to calm down slightly as soon as she was safe in my arms. The adrenaline running low in my system now. All the beating I took before was starting to affect me, and I needed to get her to safety before I let it take over. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I said, pulling away from her and holding her at arm's length so I could look at her. "Mommy, your wrists," she said, peering down at them after I moved them to hold her arms. "I know," I whispered. "I'll be okay, but you need to listen to me. I'm going to get us out of here, but I have to shift so we can move faster. What I do, you are to climb onto my back and you are to hold on tight. Understand me?" "Yes, Mommy," she whispered, nodding before I picked her back up. Holding her tightly to me, I looked around before running to the door that led to some stairs that went up to the main floor of the house. "It's a good thing I know my way," and I whispered more or less to myself before I cautiously made my way up to the ground floor. Looking around through the doorway at the top of the stairs, I waited to make sure the coast was clear before I ran for the front door of the pack house that I was now in. I threw the door open, not caring if someone saw or heard me now as I made a dash for the trees. If they followed me, they'd stop at their territory line because I'm sure by now Mom was looking for us and the last thing they'd want to do for now would be to piss off an already angry old Alpha. "Stop her." I heard a shout behind me, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw that it was Blake. Running faster, I disappeared into the tree line before setting Abigail on her feet and shifting into my white wolf. Not caring about shredding my clothes I was wearing, I found myself in my wolf form before I lay down so Abigail could climb onto my back. Glancing at my front paws, you could see the red and tender flesh from where those shackles had been, and they still hurt, but I was pushing through the pain to get back to the safety of Norman's pack. feeling Abigail lay as flat as she can on my back and hold on tightly. I looked over my shoulder as I stood up, the sound of the approaching threat getting louder. Facing forwards once more, I pushed my feet to run, carrying me and Abigail as far from here as fast as possible. I could feel my wolf tiring out as we continued to run. I wasn't sure how far I was from home. I never paid much attention in the car that day with Norman when he first found out about Blake being my ex-mate. I didn't care if I had to push myself to run past exhaustion. I wasn't stopping until I was in familiar territory. And even then I wasn't stopping until we were both safely in our beds back at the pack house where Blake couldn't get to us so easily without a fight. I glanced over my shoulder, looking behind me to see if any of his pack had caught up with me, but I knew they hadn't. I was a fast runner, but then again I could never be too careful, and I wasn't as fast as an alpha either. My pace slowed only slightly when I could see the familiar area that was home, but the sight before me made me want to weep with tears of joy. Running full speed towards Abigail and me were 5 wolves, and the big black one at the front told me that Norman was with them and leading them. "Mummy, look," Abigail shouted, sitting up as my pace slowed considerably, the beatings and exhaustion hitting me full force before Norman and the others even reached me. Without even knowing what happened, I found myself on the ground and fighting to keep my eyes open. "Mummy," I heard Abigail's voice as I felt her small hands on the back of my neck while I watched Norman shift and pull on a pair of shorts before reaching me. "Riley," he said with his voice weak with worry, "keep your eyes open for me, please." I felt my body shift back to human form, leaving me naked in front of everyone there and causing me to curl up into fetal position. I could feel Norman's eyes on me as he took in every cut and bruise on my body after what Blake did before his eyes landed on my wrists. I heard him growl before the next thing I know I'm wrapped in a blanket and lifted into, not Norman's arms but Matt's. When I look for Norman, I see he's transformed back into the beautiful black wolf of his. "Hold on, really," I hear Matt whisper before I feel myself placed on Norman's back and my eyes fire close as exhaustion takes over. Chapter 17. She just needs rest, Alpha. I heard the familiar voice of the pack doctor speaking into the blackness that surrounded me. "She'll wake up when she's ready." I felt something small lying against my side with my arm around them as I took in my surroundings with just my senses of sound, smell and feeling as my eyes wouldn't open yet. I could hear the same familiar, yet annoying, sound of the heart monitor and smelt the same disinfectant as last time. I was in the room used as the pack's hospital ward once again, and it doesn't surprise me either. If I had to guess, the small object against my side that was in my arms would be Abigail lying beside me. "Don't give me that." I finally heard Norman's reply to what the doctor said moments ago. "It's been a few days since we got her back and she still hasn't woken up." Had it really been a few days since I escaped Blake back at my old pack house when he kidnapped me and Abigail? "Quit your bickering," I finally managed to whisper out, my voice hoarse and raw from not using it and causing the room I was in to fall quiet. "Riley," I heard Norman's voice call out with relief flowing through it as his hands grasped my free one that wasn't around Abigail. As I slowly opened my eyes, I realized that I felt a strange and annoying sensation on my nose. So when I looked down, I spotted the breathing connected to it. Taking my hand away from Norman for a second, I lifted it up and pulled the cord away from my nose and tossed it aside before letting him take my hand once more. "Don't ever scare me like that again, really," Norman said as he released my hand before placing both of his on my cheeks to make me look at him. "I'm sorry, Norman," I whispered as I peered up at him, his blue eyes seeming to be rimmed with red like he'd been crying or hadn't slept any. "Mummy," I heard her say before both Norman and I looked down to the little girl that had been sleeping in my arms. "Hey, sweetie," I said, smiling as she peered up at me, and a smile seemed to brighten her face when she realized I was awake. "Mummy," she said as she sat up quickly before tightly wrapping her arms around me in a hug. "Hey, sweetie," I said, hugging her back as I looked up to see Norman smiling at the sight of me hugging this little girl. After a few minutes, Abigail snuggled back into my side and seemed to be out within seconds. "She stayed right there on that bed the whole time since we brought you both back," Norman said after a few minutes when I was still staring at the little girl in my arms. "I bet you didn't leave this room either," I said, looking at him. "Didn't you get any sleep, Norman?" I'll sleep tonight when you're back in bed beside me, he said as I peered up at him, seeing the love in his eyes that I don't think had been there in so long. The doctor going to let me go tonight? I asked with a smile. He said as soon as you woke up you'd be able to. Norman said as he reached down and grabbed my hand once more. I was so scared, really. When I watched you collapse out there, I thought I was about to lose you too. You're not going to lose me, Norman, I said, squeezing his hand tightly. Can't get rid of me that easily now. I watched as he smiled before he looked to our hands. I think we should announce tomorrow they've claimed a new mate, he said after a few minutes before he lifted his blue eyes to look at me. But only if you're ready for me too. It's your call, Norman, I said, smiling at him. But it's your say to really. He countered, it involves you just as much as it involves me. Then I guess we're telling everyone tomorrow, I said, smiling as I watched him smile back at me. With this threat from Blake, it'd probably be best to tell the pack now they'd be able to help Norman protect me. But that also means that I will have someone watching me all the time now. Later that afternoon, I was finally released from the hospital ward in the pack house and allowed to walk around. But of course Norman was by my side the entire time. Most of the pack, if now all, had found out what happened to me by now, and every member that spotted me walking around asked how I was feeling and if I was okay. It felt so weird that people were genuinely worried about me, but it was a good kind of weird. Every time, I'd smile and tell them I was fine and that I was a survivor, that nothing could keep me down for long. By the time Norman got me upstairs to our room, I don't guess he was going to allow me to sleep in the room I'd been given anymore. It was late and Abigail had already been put to bed for the night. I was in nothing more than one of his large shirts where he was in only a pair of pajama bottoms as we laid down on the bed together. Not exactly tired as of yet. I don't think I really pictured this man as one to cuddle. But after that first night I shared a bed with him, that quickly changed. We were lying above the covers for now. All the lights in the room off and the only light came from outside by the moon above. I was pulled close to his side, his arm wrapped around my waist as my head rested on his shoulder. He was on his back while I was on my side, facing him, with my hand placed on his chest. I didn't mean to scare you, I whispered out into the silence after a while as I felt his hand tighten on my hip where it rested. I know you didn't, he whispered back after a few minutes. But you and Abigail are back safe and sound, and that's all that matters to me right now. I sat up slightly to look at him, a smile on my face. Why couldn't I have been paired with someone like you instead of that asshole I had? I asked as his face dark and slightly at the mention of Blake. Let's not worry about him, he said before he pushed me onto my back and rolled to hover over me. You're with me now, and I'll never let anything bad happen to you again if I can help it. I smiled up at him as his dark brown hair framed his face as he peered down at me, his arms supporting his weight above me just like they had the other morning when I first woke up in bed with him. I watched as his blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of my face before they lingered on my lips and then down to my neck where my marks at his mark. I bit down slightly on my lower lip as I peered up into his blue eye, my arms moving to rest up on his shoulders. A second later, he lowered his head towards mine before his lips pressed gently against my own, the scruff of his chin tickling my chin. He brought his body closer to mine, but still keeping his weight off of me, as my hands clasped behind the back of his head to hold him in place as I enjoyed the kiss. After a few minutes, I felt his tongue dart out to pry my lips open so that he could deepen the kiss. I didn't hesitate to allow him access. His body was now pressing against mine, as I allowed his tongue to search the familiar territory of my mouth. He pulled away from my mouth, leaving little opened mouth kisses in his wake as his lips traveled down from the edge of my lips and down towards the mark, before kissing all around the edge of it. I bit my lip hard to suppress a moan as he finally placed his lips on the mark and began sucking gently on the patch of flesh. My eyes closed as I enjoyed the feeling, but it didn't last long before he pulled back from my neck and then lifted his body off of mine. Opening my eyes, I peered up at him confused as he seemed to be having some sort of inner battle behind his blue eyes. We need to stop now, or I won't be able to stop at all. I don't want to stop, I said before bringing his lips right back to my own. Chapter 18. He pulled back after a couple of seconds, looking down into my eyes. "You're sure about this?" "There's no rush." "I'm sure," I said, smiling up at him. "People might think everything about our relationship is rushed, but I don't care. I've never been so happy like I am now since the day you first kissed me." I watched as he smiled down at me, moving his hand so that he could brush his thumb against my cheek. "Every time I look at you since that day," he said with his blue eyes peering down at me, "I seem to fall more for you every time, or it got so hard to keep from marking you. Then that day in the meadow when you said I could mark you, my wolf and I were so happy." "Enough talking, Norman," I said, smiling up at him as I brushed my own hand against his cheek. "I'm ready now." Smiling, he brought his lips back down to mine as he moved his hand away from my cheek. I felt the hand to rest against my inner thigh, just under the hem of the shirt I was wearing. I pulled out of the kiss and looked down to his hand with a smile as he sat back on his legs, using both hands to grip the hem of the shirt and slowly lift it up and pull it over my head, leaving me in nothing more than my bra and panties. He tossed the shirt away before he bent over and placed soft kisses on the exposed flesh of my chest that wasn't covered by the bra I was sporting. I smiled down at him, biting my lower lip to suppress a moan as his kisses left the skin of my chest tender and sensitive to his touches. My back arched at one point, allowing him to reach behind and unclasp the hook to my bra. He wasted no time before pulling the bra away from my body, exposing my breast to him for the first time. I felt a blush creep up onto my cheeks as he stared down at my chest before lowering himself down so that he was lying flat against me between my thighs as he attached his mouth to my right nipple. I felt a breathless gasp leave me as his warm mouth attached to me, the stubble on his chin tickling my hypersensitive skin. His fingers trailed lightly up and down my sides, tickling me at my ribcage and causing goosebumps to rise on my flesh in his fingers' wake. "You're so responsive," he mumbled as he pulled his mouth away from my nipple to smile up at me before he moved on to the left one. "Norman," I moaned out as the sensation became too much, and I was becoming too impatient. I felt his body shake with a deep laugh as he pulled away from me completely as he lifted himself up by his arms until he was hovering over me. "Someone's impatient," he said, smiling down at me before lowering his mouth to mine once again as one of his hands started at the base of my neck and slowly trailed down my body, going between the valley of my breasts and circling around my belly button before tracing the hem of my panties. "Goosens dries in my skin touched. Just how wet have I made you, baby girl?" he whispered as his voice seemed to deepen while his fingers snuck under the fabric of my panties. I sucked in a gulped breath as his fingers moved lower until they were lightly tracing my lower lips before dipping between my moist folds as he watched my face and reaction to his movements. "You're so wet, baby girl," he groaned out as he moved his fingers up and down along my slit before twirling them around the sensitive jewel at the top, causing my body to twitch and jerk slightly from the new sensation I was feeling. He groaned out again before lowering his head until his lips landed on my mark where he began to nibble lightly on it. I moaned out, unable to stop myself from the overload of pleasure I was receiving at that point in time. In that next second, his fingers moved away from my sensitive pleasure button and down to my entrance where he slowly one finger. My eyes clapped shut as my legs opened more, giving him better access to what he was doing, before I felt my hips rising up to meet the small thrusts he was doing with his single finger. "You like that?" he asked as he pulled away from my neck as I could feel his eyes on me before I opened mine to look up at him. "Norman," I whispered out breathlessly. "Please." He groaned out before removing his hand from me and pulling it out from inside my panties. I watched as he brought his finger up to his lips, tasting me on him before he placed his hands on either side of my hips and slowly began to tug my panties down and finally lay me completely bare to his eyes as he tossed them to the side with the shirt. Before he could lean back down over me, I sat up slightly, my hands finding his waistband and tugging his boxers and pajama bottoms down over his hips. I got them down to his knees that he was putting his weight on before he pulled my hands away and lifted his legs to kick them off and to the floor. I stared at his proudly standing erection, mesmerized by the sight of it, before he lightly pushed me on my back and moved my thighs apart so that he could situate himself between them once again. I looked down, watching as he edged closer and closer to my waiting entrance before his hand lifted up and lifted my chin up so that I was looking up at him. "I'll try and be as gentle as I can," he whispered as he peered down at me, his blue eyes showing worry that he'd hurt me more than was in his control. Nodding my understanding, I brought my hand up to the back of his neck and pulled him closer so that I could bring his lips to mine once again, just as I felt the tip of his shift nudging at my lower lips. Taking a deep breath, I willed my body to relax as he used his tongue to pry my lips open and deepen the kiss just before his hips pushed forward sharply, taking my innocences away that I had saved for my first mate, but never got to give until now. I pulled my mouth away from Norman's as I whimpered out in pain and bit my lower lip to keep from crying out louder. "Sure," Norman whispered soothingly as he used his hand to brush away the strands of hair that moved into my face as he stilled any other movements. "I'm sorry, baby girl. It'll pass." I closed my eyes tightly as I felt a traitor's stare slowly slide down my cheek, only to be caught by Norman's thumb as he gently glided it across my cheek soothingly. "Are you all right?" he asked after a couple of minutes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice sounding weak as I slowly opened my eyes and looked at him, forcing a small but genuine smile onto my face. I lifted my hand up to his cheek, looking up into his blue eyes, before I used that hand to bring his mouth back to mine as I wiggled my hips slightly to get him to move now that the pain had lessened. He smiled into the kiss, not releasing my lips as he slowly pulled out and pushed back in just as slowly, trying to make this last as long as it should for my first time. I moaned out into his mouth as he hit all the right places deep inside me, places I didn't even know could hold so much pleasure to them, as he slowly picked up his pace. His lips slowly left mine, allowing me to gap open with soundless gasps coming from me as he continued his assault on my body, leaving a trail of kisses from my mouth all the way down to the mark on my shoulder. "You like that, baby girl?" he whispered against the mark as he picked up the pace again with his thrusts, making it harder for me to even make a sound or even focus on answering him for that matter. My arms were wrapped around his shoulders, holding him in place above me as his mouth returned to my mark. I felt a burning deep in the pit of my stomach and traveling lower into my abdomen, creating a sort of knot feeling. And when he decided to bite down on the mark again, I knew I was done for. His member hitting that special spot inside him, biting down onto the mark he'd given me. I felt the knot tighten before completely loosening up and my climax washing over me in a tidal wave. I cried out his name as I felt my walls clenching around him as he continued the thrust into me, allowing me to ride out the intense orgasm as he tried to reach his own release. He pulled his mouth away from my shoulder before crashing his lips into mine just as I felt his shaft twitch inside me, followed by the warmth of his seed as it poured into me. As he came down from his high, he rested his forehead against mine as he pulled his lips away from my own and closed his eyes, our chests heavily rising and falling with our ragged breathing. I watched him as he took his time to regain his normal breathing, his head still resting against mine as he held his body weight up by his arms while his member was still tucked away inside. Slowly softening, he slowly opened his eyes, a smile crossing his face as he peered down at me before placing a light peck on my lips. I winced slightly as he rolled off of me, his spent member pulling out. "Did I hurt you?" Having obviously noticed the wince I made. "No," I said, shaking my head and looking over at him with a smile. That was the best feeling I had had. That pain in the start was only natural, but you didn't hurt me in the way you're thinking. He nodded hesitantly before wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me flush against him so that he was spooning me. "You know," he said after a few minutes of silence, "everyone's going to know we're fully mated now, whether they knew about your mark or not. They'll smell our scents as being mixed instead of just combined." "I know," I said, smiling even though he couldn't see it as he rested his head into the back of my hair. "We're still telling the pack tomorrow, right? About you claiming me as your mate." "Yes," he whispered out as his arm tight and around me, "but maybe we could add something else to the list of things we're announcing to them tomorrow." "Like what?" I asked, curious as I turned slightly to look at him over my shoulder as he propped himself up on the arm he was laying on. "Marry me, really," he said with a look of total seriousness, as all I could do at that moment was gasp in shock. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.